Well, an official welcome to In Dialogue, Smithsonian Objects and Social Justice. This is a collaborative program hosted by educators from the National Portrait Gallery, and joining us this month, the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Our key question for this evening is, how does community sustain well-being in the face of systemic inequity? We're going to explore this question in relationship to a 1946 artwork in the American Art Museum's collection called Campfire in the Park by Beauford Delaney, and LaToya Ruby Frazier's photographs documenting the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, which some of those photographs are currently on view at the Portrait Gallery in an exhibition called Kinship. Although we're getting together today from different places, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. My name is Brianna White. I'm the head of education for the National Portrait Gallery, and I am joined by three amazing colleagues who will each introduce themselves in turn.
Hi, everyone. My name is Phoebe Hilleman, and I'm the Teacher Institutes Educator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Jocelyn, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Coe, and I am Student Programs Coordinator at the National Portrait Gallery. Anne?
Hello, everyone. My name is Anne Showalter. I'm the Acting Head of Interpretation at the Smithsonian American Art Museum.
So this program will be recorded. If you turn your camera or microphone on, the audio or video feed from your device may be captured on the recording and used for Smithsonian purposes. Please take care to conceal from view and not share material that is private, sensitive, or confidential. We will be asking you to engage with us and with each other using the chat box during the program this evening. Also, this program is being live captioned. To view the captions, enable live transcript CC at the bottom of your screen. And we just wanted to go over a few of the community norms. And let me advance to the next slide. So, keyword is respect. We're here to engage in an open discussion and exchange of ideas. And we really encourage listening and sharing with respect. Also, consider your privacy. Please do not share personal information about yourself or anyone else that you would not want known. In addition, we ask that inappropriate content not be shared. We welcome critiquing ideas, but not people. And finally, be present, patient, and compassionate. We're creating a safe space, and we recognize that we come to this conversation with different lived experiences, perspectives, and ideas. And while we may not agree on everything, we can definitely learn from each other and build community.
So I think if we go to the next slide, Jocelyn, we are going to return to that warm-up question that we had on the screen when everyone was joining. And I've been reading through the responses in the chat, and I just wanted to voice some of those responses and pull out some of the common themes that I've been seeing. So I'm seeing a lot of people share words like support and connection. Some people are noting kind of the linguistic roots of the word community and similar words like communion and common that might be linked in their meanings. And a lot of people are talking about sort of the human nature of community, bringing up people, specifically family, the idea of a shared experience. And some people are thinking about particular local communities in their hometown. Church community came up. So we've got a really a great start thinking about all the different ways that community can manifest and what that means to us. So thank you for sharing those ideas.
And it'll be important to remember all of those ideas, thinking about what community is to you, because we will come back to this term throughout our program, which does lead us to our essential question for the evening, which is, how does community sustain well-being in the face of systemic inequity? So Phoebe and I have chosen 2 artworks, which we are going to each take a deep dive into, and then we'll bring both artworks onto the screen so we can start to make connections between the artworks, their stories, think about chronology and things that are happening over time, which will then all bring us back to our essential question. So with that, Phoebe is going to kick us off with our first artwork for the evening.
Great, thanks, Brianna. And here's the essential question once more, which we shared at the beginning. So we're going to dive in with some close looking at our first artwork here. And I want to begin by just inviting you to look closely. And I think Anne's going to pop a link in the chat to the artwork in case you want to look at it on your own browser and zoom in on any of the details. Thanks, Anne. So feel free to respond in the chat as you're looking. And the first thing that I'm going to ask you to think about is just, what do you see? What do you notice in this painting that you could physically point to? What are some of the things that start standing out to you? And that could be objects, people, colors, shapes, shadows, lines. And again, feel free to share those thoughts in the chat. And then I'm going to, as those are coming in, just ask Brianna to share if she doesn't mind what she's noticing.
Yeah, of course. Phoebe, every time I look at this, I love the lines, the way that the artist is creating space, using the lines along with the sort of shadows and the shading of the colors. And we had already had a comment pop in about that there are lots of vibrant colors that are in this portrait.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people are noticing the colors, and Adrian notes sort of a warmth that we feel maybe through the choice of colors. We also, you talked about the lines, Brianna. I'm seeing people in the chat noticing a lot of curved lines, circles. I see the word balance. And some people are also noticing Leticia, I hope I'm getting your name right, is noticing the directional elements such as the arrows. So we see kind of on the bottom left and then the top right, these arrows signaling direction. Jacqueline's noticing movement, color mixing, reflections, energy, lots of lighting. So yeah, this idea of light and warmth keeps coming up. Denise is noticing the brush strokes. I'm describing them as broad and thick. Love that. This painting always reminds me of kind of like a Van Gogh painting, just those really thick brush strokes like you'd see in Starry Night.
I was also struck, Phoebe, by somebody had mentioned the silhouetted figures. Just this idea that we've got these forms of people, but we don't necessarily have all of the very specific details that might make up an individual.
Yeah. Absolutely. Their features are kind of obscured. And Chuck is noticing sort of this sort of scene of what's going on here, the gathering around heat. Looks like there's a fire in the center of this painting. Awesome. And Jean Paul is noticing the difference in the position of the arms of people gathered. Right. So my next question, and please continue to look closely and notice more things because there's so much to look at here. But how does this painting make you feel as you're looking at it? What feelings or emotions start to emerge? And again, you're welcome to share in the chat if you'd like to, but you can also just think about that for yourself.
I saw hopeful already.
Yep. Brianna, what about you? Do you have any emotional response to this?
Phoebe, I mean, only because I know a little bit about this piece. I was thinking about what Nanette said in the chat about it's very heavy with layers and design, but I was thinking that it's very it's very heavy because, I don't know, because there's this darkness to the scene. There's a sense of it being at night that we don't really get to see a lot of, we don't get to see details of faces. So there's, and then it leads me, of course, to a question, which I know I'm not going to answer yet because that is coming. But it feels heavy because they're all gathered around this heat. So it feels heavy.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm getting a little bit of that in the comments too. There's sort of we're hearing both hopefulness and words like sadness and isolation are coming up. So this idea of, Denise is saying there's a supportive community around the fire can, but we're also, when I look at this, I'm wondering, why are these people huddling around this fire, this fire in what looks to be a trash can outdoors? So what are their circumstances? Why did they gather here in this place? And, it looks, we get the sense that it might be cold because they're huddling around this fire for warmth. Yeah, so Chuck is noting in the chat, maybe these people lack heat or warmth with lack of shelter, and this is where they go to get it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is, not an unfamiliar type of scene, perhaps, if you live in a city or have visited. Makes me think of homeless communities that I've encountered here in DC. And then seeing Carol's noting some tension together to stay warm but separate in their experience with space between them. Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting point, because the more I'm looking at it, I'm noticing that there's, at first I sort of saw them all as sort of similar figures, but then I'm noticing that some of them are kind of standing off to the side. The figure that's wearing a cap on the far right seems to be a little bit outside of the circle. So there are these spaces, where there's a little bit of ambiguity about the relationships between these individuals.
Right, and Dana. And yeah, Dana's noticing both the inequity and solidarity happening at the same time. Yeah.
So we've already started to kind of unpack a few of these ideas about what this painting makes us think about. But I'll invite you to continue with that, and also what it makes you wonder about. What questions do you have looking at this painting? And again, you're welcome to share your questions in the chat. JB's saying, seems the firelight is reflecting on all of the people and the objects nearby.
And I'm, Phoebe, I'm curious about the where of it, where this is taking place, because obviously, I mean, we know the title, right? That because I said it at the beginning, but there's this sense of nature, and yet there also is like a street light. So not just, I guess, where they are, but like perhaps where in the country they are as well.
Yeah, and that was the question that came up in the chat too. Like, where are we? Is this a real space? Is it some imaginative space? It's sort of semi-realistic, but yeah, we get these hints of city life, like the manhole, or that's what I'm reading it as in the foreground on the right, street lights. Somebody noted that it looks like maybe like a basketball court behind these figures, but it's a little bit ambiguous. Stephanie's wondering if this is normal for some of these people, right? Is this an everyday experience? And wondering if the figure on the outside is standing behind a child or someone familiar, looking after them, or unfamiliar, so they're staying back. Interesting. And Ramona's wondering about the creator and whether they were composing from experience or from external observation. Beautiful. So that's a perfect segue, because we are going to share a little bit more about the artist Beauford Delaney. If you want to go to the next slide, Jocelyn. So I know we shared this at the beginning and in the description of this event, but again, this piece is titled "Can Fire in the Park" and was made in 1946 by Beauford Delaney. And if you go to the next slide, this is a portrait of him that's in the Portrait Gallery's collection, actually, by Georgia O'Keeffe, which I love. But I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on his life story, and then we'll return to the artwork a little bit. But Delaney was born in around the turn of the century, 1901, in Knoxville, Tennessee. He's one of 10 children. He's the 8th of 10 children. His father was a preacher, and his mother was a cleaner and a laundress, and she had been born into slavery. And his childhood, his family kind of continually struggled with economic poverty, but they were, very involved in Knoxville's Black community, particularly through the church. And Beauford was really encouraged by his family to pursue his interest in art. His younger brother, Joseph, actually became a noted artist as well. And he, growing up in Knoxville as a Black man, during this time period, he certainly experienced, witnessed incidents of racism that was a part of his experience. In 1919, when he's just sort of entering young adulthood, he experienced the Knoxville race riot, which was started by a white lynch mob storming the county jail in search of Maurice Mays, who was a biracial man who had been accused of murdering a white woman. So that's sort of the context that he was in around the time that he started thinking about leaving Knoxville. And in 1923, he left for Boston to study art. He took classes, but he also did a lot of learning just by visiting museums and kind of immersing himself in art history. Really influenced by Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. As we noticed with his brush strokes, very, similar to Van Gogh, as we talked about. And, he's also at this time starting to experience struggles with his mental health that he would experience for the rest of his life. And he's also grappling with his sexuality. He's a gay man at a period in time when he doesn't feel safe being a gay man in public. That's also something that he deals with throughout his life. And then in 1929, he moves to New York City. And thinking about 1929, this is during the Harlem Renaissance, but it's also the year of the stock market crash, right? So we're entering the Great Depression as a country. So there's a huge amount of economic instability and poverty. And Delaney actually has this experience the first night that he spends in New York. He ends up getting scammed out of his apartment that he had been planning to rent. He dropped off his first 2 weeks of rent money and his bags and went out for a couple hours and came back, and he was told that they didn't know who he was and his belongings were gone. So he ended up having to spend his first night in New York on a park bench. He continued to struggle financially. He was able to get on his feet and find a place to live, and supported himself with a variety of jobs, as a hotel bellhop, later an art teacher. And he kind of lived both first in Harlem and later in Greenwich Village, and became a part of a community of artists, writers, and activists there in New York. Greenwich Village was interesting because it wasn't a neighborhood where many African American people lived at this time. And so I think this quote from Delaney's biographer, David Leeming, is really interesting, sort of describing his life in New York as very compartmentalized. He said he kept his life in compartments. His Black friends knew little of his white friends. His gay friends knew little of his straight ones. Those compartments gradually became voices that argued with each other and taunted their host. So I think that's really telling, and gives us insight into sort of the complexity of the experience that he was having at this time. But I do want to note one of his most important relationships during his life. And if you want to go to the next slide. Thank you. So he was close friends with James Baldwin, the influential writer and activist. He met Baldwin when James Baldwin was a teenager, and Baldwin went on to sort of consider Delaney a spiritual father and a mentor to him. And they both shared the experience of being Black and gay in a racist and homophobic society. And I'll just share a quote from James Baldwin on his friend, Beauford Delaney. He said, "He has been starving and working all of his life in Tennessee, in Boston, in New York, and now in Paris." They later lived in Paris at the same time. "He's been menaced more than any other man I know by his social circumstances, and also by all the emotional and psychological stratagems he's been forced to use to survive. And more than any other man I know, he has transcended both the inner and outer darkness." So if you go to the next slide, Jocelyn. I want to bring us back to the painting now that I've kind of sped through all of that biography, and just think about knowing a little more about the artist's life. What new thoughts or feelings come up looking at this painting? And I encourage you to respond in the chat, but Brianna, if you have any initial thoughts, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, as you were talking, Phoebe, I was thinking about Initially, I was thinking about the beauty of this painting, right? The bright, vibrant colors that we had been talking about previously. And I kept coming back to yellow and the places where we see this yellow, right, in the light, in the fire. And it's almost as if the yellow is, it's almost as if Delaney is trying to shine a light on something that people are not necessarily thinking about or aware of. Because again, when we look at this piece, like there are lots of various places where the brightness of the yellow really shines through.
I love that, that idea of shining a light on people who often exist in the darkness or people overlook. And I'm seeing in the chat, Chuck's noting people who are ostracized. Tessa's noticing that the perspective is of someone looking from the outside in. Interesting, so not part of the community. Becky is wondering if he's standing outside the group, observing and learning in his new place. Interesting. Yeah, I don't know if you're looking at the figure on the far right, but I've sometimes looked at that figure and wondered, you know, did Beauford Delaney sort of see himself in that figure, kind of part of the community, but also a little bit outside? And I also just see such an empathy and almost a tenderness for the people depicted in this painting that I find really moving.
Yeah, I agree.
Beautiful. I'm loving the comments in the chat. Thank you. Ramona, he says he's Black and yet still other. Yeah, it's interesting to me that these figures are so obscured. You don't get their facial features at all, but you do sort of get a sense perhaps of their skin color. They do seem to have darker skin here. So I'm wondering if that was an intentional choice by the artist. So I don't want to take up more of my time than I already have. So I want to make sure we get to our next artwork, and we're going to come back to this one and bring them together. But the next artwork we'll be looking at this evening is a photograph, and sort of brings us a little bit closer to our present time period. So Brianna, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Phoebe. Okay, thank you, Jocelyn, for moving us ahead. And Anne is going to put a link to the object in the chat for the same reason that we did with Campfire in the Park. If you want to take a closer look at this particular photograph, I would definitely encourage you to click on the link and you can zoom in. But I want to start the way that we did with our previous image, and that is taking a few moments to look. And when you're ready to respond in the chat, what do you notice? Make lots of observations. What are all of the things that you see? What are all of those wonderful visual details that make up this image? Right. So, okay. So right away, right, we're seeing reflections upon reflections, which means we've got multiple mirrors. And in addition to reflections, right, we're thinking about perhaps the ancestral lineage, or thinking about different ages being represented, which means, of course, that we're thinking about different perspectives. Okay, what else? What else are we seeing? Reference to Manet's painting with mirrors. The foreground, right, very, very foreground, bottom left hand, we see a hand. Frames, putting oneself in a frame. And so not only are we seeing individuals represented from the front, but because of the mirrors, we're seeing the back of the individuals as well. Okay. And there are photos in the front. Sorry, Phoebe, go ahead.
I was just going to shout out Adrian's comment. She says that there's a sense of generativity, all the reflections, looking forward and looking back simultaneously.
Right. It's really beautiful, right?
Forward and back. Yeah.
Okay, we'll keep those observations coming in. And I guess, what are you starting to think about this work? Because what we see, right, is we see an individual looking in a mirror, staring at us, but then we see a young person looking in a mirror where we see her reflection. And then again, one of the very specific details of this work that's hard to make out is then we have a third person who we only see in the mirror. And yes, Jean-Paul is saying, is this the person taking the photo? And the answer is yes. So we have these three women. One we see from the front, one we see from the back, and then the other one we see from the front in the reflection. So, and we're in this living type of space. So I guess now that we've talked about those visual details, what thoughts start to come to mind, perhaps about this work, wonderings that you might have about what has brought you know, this group of women together? I admit I am struck by the why of it. It's a pretty unique photograph, and seeing three individuals in this way. Right, so JB is saying that the viewer is included in the viewing. Perhaps we are looking at three generations. But perhaps also we're looking at a depth of experience. Generational trauma, but also maybe this is a safe enclosed space, but also open to something else through the mirror. We often think about portraits as windows and mirrors, right? It's a mirror to look back on our own identity, but it's also a window into somebody else's world. Okay, this idea of thinking about memory. Okay, excellent. So before we move on, I think that it's important to give you a little bit of context around this work. So the artist who created this is LaToya Ruby Frazier. And she is the individual that's represented only in the mirror, in the background of this photograph. And Frazier first traveled to Flint, Michigan in 2016 as part of a magazine commission to create a photo essay about the water crisis that was happening there. And during that trip, she met Shay Cobb, who is the woman in the foreground facing us. And Shay Cobb is a Flint poet. She's an activist. She's a mother, and she became Frazier's collaborator in what would evolve into a 5-year body of work. And then the young girl who is in our middle ground, that is Zion, that is Shay's daughter. And so this 5-year body of work is divided into 3 acts, and it's called Flint is Family. And the project follows Cobb as she fights for her family's and her community's health and well-being by tracing the lives of these generations of women, because part of this series also includes Shay's mother as well. So as we get a little bit of context around this image, this context will hopefully inform my next question, which is how can we relate this work that we're taking a look at to ourselves and to our own experiences? And again, you can think about it in multiple ways, right? You can think about the story that I'm starting to tell you about Frazier, but you can also think about it in terms of really what it is that we are seeing in this particular photograph. Phoebe, what do you think? It's a big question, I know, but
it is. I mean, for me, I'm really connecting to the mother-daughter relationship that we're seeing play out here. I'm not a mother, but I'm a daughter, and just thinking about my own mother, I see, knowing some of the background of this story, I see love in this photograph. I see sacrifice in this photograph. I see a sort of sense of determination on Shay's face, and I think I relate to that, just thinking about, my own mom and the way that she would do anything that needed to be done for our family. And so I think that's the connection I'm making. And also thinking about, just the centrality of her in this photograph. I feel like in all of our family albums, my mom is not in a lot of those photos because she's the one taking them. So
right.
This idea of, we do see the photographer through the mirror, but she's sort of, somebody said in the chat, she's like a participant observer. But I love that Shay is so front and center in this photo.
Right. And I want to go back to what Leticia had said in the chat about Frazier being a participant observer. And it's so true, because Frazier really believed, she saw the Cobb family as kindred spirits, right? She herself, her family, they endured systemic abuse in the town where she grew up, a small steel mill town, Braddock, Pennsylvania. And so Frazier and Shay, they immediately recognized their common lineage, if you will, their shared experience, which enabled them to work together to shed light and to bring to light, what was happening in Flint, Michigan. So, we're continuing to talk about this piece, and I would encourage everyone to think about how we can connect this story to bigger stories, which leads me to sort of what I was thinking about with the artist, LaToya Ruby Frazier, who really employs, this radically intimate Black and white documentary approach. And she is really capturing the complexity, the injustice, but also simultaneously the hope of the Black American experience. And she's using her camera and the medium of photography as an agent of social change, which feels sort of very similar in a lot of ways to what we were talking about with campfire in the park as well. So Jocelyn, can you move on to the next slide? I just want to very briefly, because I want us to bring both of our images back on screen again. I want to show you three other images from Flint is Family. On the left-hand side, you see an image of Zion getting water because she's brushing her teeth. In the middle, you have the Flint, the water plant. And then on the right-hand side, you have Shay and Zion, who are actually in Mississippi in this photograph, because once I think Shay realized at some point, probably in about 2017, that she needed to step away from Flint and moved to Mississippi to spend time with her dad. But then she came back again. And so there are three acts to Flint is Family. The first is about Shay, her mother, her daughter Zion in Flint, Michigan. And then Act 2 transitions us to Newton, Mississippi, where Shay and Zion stay for a while. And then Act 3 of Flint is Family brings us back to Flint, Michigan, when the 26,000-pound atmospheric water generator came to Flint. The atmospheric water generator has the capacity to produce about 3,500 gallons of fresh water every day, with a storage capacity of 528 gallons. That's huge. And so Frazier was using Flint is Family to not only to talk about the crisis, but also to talk about the hope as well. Okay, that was a lot too. So Phoebe, with the addition of all of this context, do we have new insights about the work that we were looking at? And Jocelyn, can you take us to the next slide?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what I'm thinking is reflected in the chat as well. Just sort of the sense of like continuity and time across generations that we talked about with the mirror effect. And Ramona's noting a timelessness to the image. Just this idea of like legacy and thinking about the future generations while also looking to the past. Because the issues of the present are shaped by the issues of the past. So yeah, I think I'm just seeing more layers in that, the composition of the image, and also just like in the directness of Shay's gaze. I think you can't look away from her in this photograph. And kind of similarly to the last painting we looked at, the artist is confronting you with people they don't want you to look away from.
Right. Thank you. Okay, I think we have transitioned to the point where we can bring both of our images on the screen, start making some connections.
Yeah, so I'm curious for people to just respond in the chat, and Brianna, you as well, but what are some of the other ways that we might be able to connect the stories of these objects, even though they take place, one was made in the 40s and one was made just in the last decade? What are some of the connections?
I mean, right, we talked about community at the very beginning of all of this, but I was thinking about how both of these images that we've taken a look at this evening are really showing us that when society fails to take care of people, that people take care of each other. And we're not seeing that necessarily in these images with hugs and affection, but these gatherings of people and the intensity of gazes. I'm just right. I'm struck by both of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat about, sense of isolation and struggle, connecting the two, but also light in the midst of struggle, shining on those in the dark. Adrian's noting that community is depicted as both people and place here. Both are representing marginalized communities. Interesting. He is saying both interrogate openness, the setting of Delaney's painting, and Shea's forthright gaze. Interesting. And Denise is talking about sort of this idea of forgotten people or people ignored by larger society. Absolutely. And I think, one thing that I'm seeing as a connection is just sort of the connection between, all these issues of racism and poverty and the implications that those things have for housing and home, and that's such a fundamental, we need a home in order to feel safe and thrive in our society. So it just thinking about the ways that all of these things are connected.
Right. And, when we were thinking about connections, and as I saw responses coming through in the chat, I was starting to think about what are some of the the big themes that have emerged after talking about and taking a look at these two objects. I mean, I think that we can all safely say that, right, one of the themes is community. I mean, we talked about it at the beginning. We've said that word so many times. I mean, that's certainly a theme that we're seeing here, but what other themes have emerged for everyone after taking a look at these objects and having this conversation?
JB says isolation, but yet connection.
Yeah. The light and the warmth being internal.
Dana says pain, history being written.
Right.
Artists pulled into their community communion.
Yeah. And yet we are, seeing hope, right? We are seeing resilience as well. In the conversations that we're having.
Leticia was saying the experience of being racialized in this country is both specific and non-specific. Yeah, and when I look at these two side by side, I sort of see this individuality versus anonymity. Like the LaToya Ruby Frazier photograph is so specific to these exact individuals, whereas the Delaney painting is a little bit more, overarching. Anybody could see themselves potentially in that painting.
Right.
Determination. returning to the arrows, the symbolism of which way should we go.
Mm-hmm. There's a comment about a ceiling light in the photo and this idea that light illuminates.
I love that. And going back to the wording of our essential question, we talked about this idea of well-being and how community can sustain well-being. So I'm wondering if there are any ideas of, how do these artworks, looking at them together, illustrate this idea of well-being or resilience?
Phoebe, every time I look at Campfire in the Park, I think about the way the group is gathered, right? And although we do have people on sort of on the outside, there is a semicircle that's forming, right? This community forming around this light, this heat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm seeing in the chat, Dana's noting the warm colors, sort of illustrating this idea of well-being, compassion, empathy, idea of making a way out of no way. And that might be connected to this idea of arrows and reflections. And helping each other. Yeah. Love that idea. Jean Paul saying well-being is at risk if we don't step up in solidarity. Great. See, Brianna, I know we're in the last 5 minutes of our time.
We are.
Did you have another question for us before we kind of
start to wrap up? I mean, I guess I'm wondering if any of the words that we were thinking about at the beginning of our time together when we were talking about community, if they especially resonate now, or if there are other words or other phrases that you might use to think about this idea of community. It sort of goes along with, why have we spent this time talking about this topic?
Yeah, and going back to some of those words we shared in the chat, a lot of them, we had family come up, and we clearly see that depicted here, but also just these ideas of support, solidarity, communion, togetherness.
Right, sharing like-minded people going through similar struggles. So we're coming back to the place where we started, right? Thinking about this question: how does community sustain well-being in the face of systemic inequity? Phoebe and I tried to choose images today that really brought us over or made us think about a span of time. As Phoebe said, the things that we're grappling with today are caused by things from the past. So, very often we can have conversations in this moment and have the ability to not only look backwards with our objects, but then, look forward and think about what are the things that we can do. And so I guess I would just say, it's a big heavy question, one that we're not trying to answer in this particular moment, but we're hoping that taking a look at these two images will continue to spark conversations. Phoebe, do you want to add anything that I might be missing?
No, that was great. I think it was interesting looking at a more sort of abstract universal image alongside a more individualized specific image. And I just think, the Flint story is also an opportunity for us to think about the hope that can be found here and the ways that communities band together and can be places of action and organizing for change. And with the example that you shared of the water generator, I think it's really powerful. And makes me think about ways that communities came together during COVID, most recently, forming mutual aid societies and things. So I think this is a topic that continues to be relevant, and I appreciated this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We were thrilled to spend this time with you. Anne is going to pop a few more links into the chat. If you're interested in programming either at the American Art Museum or with the Portrait Gallery, these are some helpful links to copy and to paste. But it's 6 p.m. on the dot. We just want to thank you for spending your time with us this evening.